favorite games. I love the setting, the lore, the battles, and the campaign system. One thing I don't love is this rulebook, and I know I'm not alone in this. While the system themselves are not that hard to learn, the rulebook really is a product of its time. Nowadays, most popular and successful tabletop games have sleek and efficient rulebooks with tons of examples, sidebars for quick reference, and diagrams for visual learning. Mordheim doesn't really have any of that. It has a few diagrams scattered here and there, but they're few and far between, and you'll still be left with questions after you've read them over. Definitely comes from an era where games had a more sink or swim kind of vibe. In my last video, I dealt with one of the issues that stems from this kind of sink or swim vibe, which is that the Mordheim rulebook offers almost zero help in terms of how to actually build a warband that stands a chance of winning early in a campaign. With that issue out of the way, I'd like to address another issue that beginners might have trouble with. The rulebook doesn't tell you what the different warbands do. For someone opening this book for the first time, it might be hard to look at all the profiles and special rules for different warriors and actually have an understanding of what those warriors are good at. For someone like me, who's a veteran of Mordheim, I can look at a beastman's profile and tell that he's a pretty good tanky frontliner. I can tell a Dreg is a pretty lousy fighter who is probably better off just trying to stay alive for the post-game, but for the uninformed reader, all this front-loaded info can be super hard to digest. So I've always thought about trying to give a quick primer about what each warband does, but I never knew when the right time was. Well, now I've actually built, painted, and played every warband from the rulebook, so now's a pretty good time to go over what the strengths and weaknesses of each warband are, and to help you figure out which one you should play. I won't be going super in depth about each individual warrior, but I will briefly talk about each of their strengths and weaknesses, and maybe try and set you up some best practices to help you build a warband that you're going to have fun playing. And plus, if you stick around, I've got an extra special warband that you won't find in the rulebook. So let's start off with the basics.
Where the hell have you been, soldier?
Training, sir! Training, sir!
What kind of training, son?
Army training, sir! Army training, sir!
Mercenaries are the bread and butter of Mordheim. They're desperate, battle-hungry men who are looking to capitalize on the chaos of civil war within the Empire by securing Weirdstone to raise their own standing. They're probably the most straightforward warband in the rulebook. Just a bunch of dudes looking to snap necks and cash checks. Their stat profiles are pretty much right down the middle in terms of strength, acting sort of as a benchmark for the other warbands to be based around. So what are some of the strengths of mercenary warbands? You do get some decent melee fighters among your heroes. You also have the swordsman henchman type, which is a warrior that gets to reroll their attacks when they're charging as long as they're equipped with swords, which can be super powerful in the first round of combat. Mercenaries also have the largest equipment list in the rulebook, which makes them a very customizable warband. Mercenaries also have access to every hired sword, giving them further customization down the road. This partially makes up for the fact that they're the only warband in the book that doesn't start with a spellcaster, which is probably their one major weakness. I guess I would say that the mercenaries are the most adaptable warband in the rulebook, which is reinforced by this next point. When building a mercenary warband, you get to pick from one of 3 cities that your warband comes from, each of which has their own perk. Reikland mercenaries are disciplined Imperial soldiers. The leader of a Reiklander warband increases his leadership range from 6 inches to 12 inches, making things like fear much easier to deal with. Also, Reikland marksmen, which is a henchman type, have a starting ballistic skill of 4 instead of 3. A Reikland mercenary warband excels at ranged combat more than any other warband in the book. Middenheim mercenaries are strong mountain men. The champions and captain all start with strength 4 instead of the normal strength 3. This makes them very powerful melee fighters, as a higher strength means you are more likely to deal a wound after a successful hit. Finally, the Marienburg warbands are wealthy traders. They receive a +1 when searching for rare items during the trading portion of the post-game. Best of all, they get to start with 20% more gold when building their warband, so 600 instead of the normal 500. This can be huge for stacking more units or adding hired swords to your starting warband. Your best bet when starting a mercenary warband is to play into the strength of the city you choose. Another cool thing is that when you build a mercenary warband, you basically have models for 3 different warbands. Sure, the 3 cities are supposed to have their own unique aesthetic, but they don't play wildly different from one another. And I don't think anyone would mind if your Marienburg warriors look a little more like Reiklanders. If you are worried about that kind of thing, maybe you could build a separate model for your leader to kind of tie the theme of the warband to. For example, this could be a perfectly good Reiklander mercenary warband, Or if I swap out the leader for this more barbarian looking guy, then suddenly you've got a group of Middenheimers. So basically, if you want to play a balanced warband type that offers tons of customization without any fiddly rules to remember, then a mercenary warband is for you. But if the mercenaries are a little straightforward for you, then let me introduce you to the next warband.
Excuse me, are y'all with the cult?
We're not a cult. We're an organization that promotes love and...
Yeah, this is it.
Cult of the Possessed is probably the polar opposite of mercenaries. They're crazed and depraved madmen who've allied with the demonic forces of chaos in their quest for power. This warband is a melee powerhouse. They got multiple warriors types that can take more than one wound, and the powerful Possessed Warrior. I chose some classic metal blood letters to represent my Possessed Warriors, as I've themed my warband kind of as a cult of Khorne, the god of slaughter. The cult's melee power does come at a cost, however, as their units are quite expensive. The Possessed hero type comes in at a whopping 90 gold, and that's before you've given them any mutations. The mutants, while they're only 25 gold each, must be given a mutation, which adds at least another 30 gold before their equipment. The high cost of these heroes can often lead people to take 2 Possessed with no mutations in their first warband, just to save money and to make sure they maximize on their heroes. The leader of the cult is the Magister. He's a chaotic spellcaster with access to chaos rituals, which are some of the most ridiculous spells in the game. Playing a Possessed warband is true chaos. You excel in close combat, but your losses in battle are often devastating, for each unit comes at a heavy price. Cult of the Possessed is probably one of the trickier warbands to start out as, but there are so many different ways to build your warband. If this is your first time playing Possessed, then I would recommend getting your full complement of heroes, but putting 0 mutations on your Possessed. They're pretty strong as is, and the increased cost of mutations will sometimes prevent you from getting your other heroes, or for getting enough henchmen to support them. For your mutants, give them whichever mutations you think sound fun, and don't break the bank too much. For example, sometimes I give this guy a tentacle, which is represented by the snake in his mouth, or I can theme it as the scorpion tail, like the snake is biting somebody. For henchmen, I try to save up for my full complement of 3 beastmen as soon as I can. They hit really hard in melee combat, and they have 2 wounds each, so even if you start with fewer models, as long as you have some beastmen stacked up, you can have almost as many wounds as some of the other starting warbands. Dark Souls are often overlooked by a lot of players because of their low weapon skill. They only start with a weapon skill of 2, which means things are going to hit them pretty easy, but it usually doesn't mean it's any harder for them to land hits. They're also great because they're immune to fear, and you can just give them some flails and throw them in front of everybody else. Anything they hit is likely going to die with their strength of 4. Brethren are fine for filling the ranks if you have some gold to spare, or if you'd like to put some range units on the board, as they can use bows. And this is kind of off script, but if you're wondering why I have 2 guys on each base for my brethren, I kind of have a lore thing in my warband where if one brethren gets promoted, they have to kill their partner, or their brother basically, to become a hero. It's kind of a little intro on how you can sort of make your warband feel more personal by adding little touches like that. You can do this with any warband, not just Possessed, obviously. So the wide variety of units and the optional mutations all come together to make playing Cult of the Possessed an absolute blast, especially with the rewards of the Shadow Lord optional rule. When your Magister or mutants gain a new skill, instead of giving them the skill, you can send them to the Shadow Lord. This can result in them either being granted some new power, being completely ignored, or being mutated beyond recognition, which makes them leave the warband forever. So if you don't mind a little chaos in your warband, then Cult of the Possessed is probably for you.
Why was I cursed with such idiot sisters?
Just lucky, I guess.
So let's go from a warband of unabashed villains to arguably the only good guys, or should I say good girls, in Mordheim. The Sisters of Sigmar are an order of warrior priestesses, dedicated to the Empire's patron god. They were some of the only residents in Mordheim who were unscathed by the twin-tailed comet, and now they seek to cleanse the city of evil and secret the Weirdstone away into the fortified vault deep within their temple. The Sisters are a more melee-focused warband, and they have a slightly stronger array of starting heroes than a mercenary warband. Their leader is a caster who can use prayers of Sigmar. Since prayers are different from spells, their leader is allowed to wear armor, whereas normally wizards cannot. The Augur is a hero with relatively low stats, but they get to re-roll dice during the game. On top of that, the Augur is allowed to roll an extra exploration die and pick between the two, which means your warband is often going to get some slightly higher income between games. Their equipment list is rather limited, but they do have access to some special starting equipment. The Sigmarite Warhammer is a very strong melee weapon. It's a one-handed weapon that gives +1 strength, and it adds +1 when rolling to wound versus undead or possessed. The Steel Whip is a melee weapon that can't be parried and gives the wielder an extra attack when being charged. The only melee weapon available to them is the Sling, which cements this warband as pretty much a close and personal sort of warband. Add to these the other holy items on their starting list, and the Sisters become a melee powerhouse that does particularly well against possessed and undead warbands. They also have a few special skills that they're allowed to choose during advancement that are all themed around prayer and smiting evil beings. This warband is absolutely dripping with theme, and is perfect if you want to play a band of holy warriors looking to cleanse evil from the city. You also might notice a special model here in the back. This model is a Dramatis Persona, basically a main character of Mordheim. Her name is Bertha Bestrelfrung, the High Matriarch of the Sisterhood. I included her in my warband basically because she's the only Dramatis Persona that the warband doesn't have to pay for. Basically, if a warband member is able to locate her, then there's a chance that she shows up to your warband if the difference between your warband rating and the enemy's is at a certain value. She'll only show up if you're an underdog, but it's worth having a model for her just in case. Because if you're outmatched by another warband, there's a good chance she'll show up and offer some support. She has some ridiculous stats, with 3 attacks, 5 weapon skill, 4 strength, and she has 2 Sigmarite Warhammers, which basically gives her 4 attacks every turn. So if you are going to build a Sisters warband, it's a good idea to have a model to represent her, on the off chance that you're absolutely outmatched by your opponent. So the Sisters of Sigmar are probably the only protagonists in Mordheim, but they aren't the only ones looking to cleanse the city of evil.